So, I want to know, what was the best speech that you have ever heard? What was the best speech you've ever heard? Name it. The best speech you've ever heard. Or the most moving speech you've ever heard.
That's easy. Locker room scene in Fishing Giants.
Okay?
Martin Luther King Jr., I Have a Dream.
I Have a Dream. Yeah, although Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream is one of the most moving, although it is perhaps lost some of its punch these days over years of exposure. By the time kids have gotten out of elementary school, they have heard this speech so many times and they've studied it so much that I almost feel like that they are no longer moved by it the way that they should be moved by it. It's become kind of this analytical exercise for them. But if you just kind of sit back and listen to it with fresh ears and maybe watch the video with fresh eyes, I can't help but be moved by it. It's a very moving speech. I think of my favorite speaker these days is a guy by the name of N.T. Wright. He is a brilliant Christian theologian from the UK, and I find him very compelling every time I hear him. I heard him speak in Phoenix about 8 months ago or so, and he's just wonderful to listen to, and he's so on target, and he spells it out so well, and he can just stand up there and talk, and it comes out like his mind works so fast. It's incredible. Perhaps the best single speech I've ever heard was by do you know who that person is? That is the late Madalyn Murray O'Hare. Madalyn Murray O'Hare, I heard her speak on campus at ASU. Some organization brought her in to make the case for atheism. She was extremely articulate and she was very engaging. Her arguments were not new, they were not very compelling, they were not very focused, but her goal was to make all of the other views look stupid in comparison to hers. So she gave this very fiery, articulate speech, and she was just punching everybody's buttons as she was going. She knew exactly what she was doing. And then she opened the floor for questions. And of course, every inarticulate and fired up Christian freshman, sophomore went to the microphone to make a name for themselves as the David who stood up to the evil Goliath. And they all sounded really stupid in comparison, so that she really didn't have to make much of her point. She didn't have to have any substance to her points because everyone else was looking so dumb. And her point was that atheism makes more sense than religion. And people would come to the microphone, they'd stumble along trying to make a point, then she'd counter with one of these well-rehearsed soundbite answers that appeared to sink the opposition. Who would then, the person at the microphone would then bounce to a totally unrelated topic, unable to respond to the one that she had just said. And dozens of students who hadn't really given a lot of serious thought to their faith and how it stands in relation to other views helped her make her point. It was a slaughter. But it was a brilliant speech. And I'll always remember that speech. In our text this morning, the Apostle Paul gives what I would consider to be his most brilliant speech. It was actually compelling. It contained all of the right elements. It was probably the most eloquent speech of any that he had ever given in his life. Paul was brilliant, And I'm sure that he was a way above average communicator in spite of that bizarre episode in chapter 20. You remember back to chapter 20? Eutychus fell asleep while during Paul's sermon, and Eutychus fell out the second-story window and died. By the way, I have put a few people to sleep over the years, but as far as I know, nobody has ever died. Nobody has ever. I've never killed anyone. Yet. You heard about the young boy, the third grader, who was just learning to read, and I probably mentioned him before, but he saw the plaque in the church narthex. Have I told you about this kid? The plaque says, in honor of those who died in the service. Going to list the names of the people from the church who had lost their lives. And he looked up at his mother with worried expression and asked, which service, 9 o'clock or 11 o'clock? Paul was a brilliant speaker and communicator. His speech here in Acts 26 was an outstanding textbook example of ancient rhetoric, formal and eloquent. He was speaking to a Jewish king, a Roman governor, and a courtroom filled with related dignitaries. He gave an outstanding defense, recalling his own personal conversion story, which, by the way, is the third time that we have heard this story told in the book of Acts. Luke must have thought it's worth repeating. Paul talked about how Jesus himself had, in a vision, appointed him to take the good news of the resurrection to the Gentiles. So verse 19, so King Agrippa, I wasn't disobedient to that heavenly vision. Instead, I proclaimed first to those in Damascus and Jerusalem, then to the whole region of Judea and to the Gentiles. My message was that they should change their hearts and their lives and turn to God, and that they should demonstrate this change in their behavior. Verse 21. Because of this, some Jews seized me in the temple and tried to murder me. God has helped me up to this very day, therefore I stand here and bear witness to the lowly and the great, rhetoric language, the lowly and the great, just a deep voice move. I'm saying nothing more than what the prophets and Moses declared should happen. Verse 23, that the Christ, the Messiah, would suffer, and that as the first to rise from the dead, he would proclaim light to both to my people and to the Gentiles, both to the Jews and to the Gentiles. There was no way that Paul could have better defended himself or better explained the gospel in that context. And from the perspective of the speech teacher, this was an A presentation. I doubt that he was looking for a standing ovation or even a round of applause, but he certainly did not get what he was looking for in it. If you look at verse 24, at this point in Paul's defense, Festus declared with a loud voice, "You've lost your mind, Paul. Too much learning is driving you mad." It was all too much for this governor who was in over his head, out of his league, really. He was clueless and without any kind of spiritual sympathy, so to his hard heart, it all sounded like a bunch of berserk blather. But Paul landed on his feet, and he replied, verse 25, "I'm not mad, most honorable Festus. I'm speaking what is sound and true. King Agrippa knows about these things, and I've been speaking openly to him. I'm certain that none of these things have escaped his attention. This has not happened secretly or in some out-of-the-way place." Just in case you're talking about conspiracy theories here. This isn't some secret thing that we're doing off in a corner here. "King Agrippa, do you believe in the prophets? I know you do." Agrippa said to Paul, "Are you trying to convince me that in such a short time you've made me a Christian?" And by the way, at that point, Christian was probably a very derogatory term. It was a brilliant message. It was a fantastic preacher. But it did not generate even a polite, canned, "Good sermon, Pastor" response. To the contrary, one powerful man thinks that he's insane, and the other powerful man thinks that he's too pushy. And whenever I read this sermon and the response that Paul received from his sermon, I feel less bad that not everyone clicks with what I have to say. And I know that some of you feel a similar frustration in your own efforts to explain Jesus to people. Perhaps you've talked with your brother or maybe your sister or a child or a friend about their need, about God's solution to the need, to the cross and the glorious resurrection. But at best, you feel like you've been talking to a brick wall, or at worst that you are starting World War III. And they make you feel stupid for trying. You feel like a failure. If only I had listened a little more closely to Pastor Brad's sermons, I would understand more. If only I was, if I'd read my Bible more and knew more of the Scriptures. If only I was smarter, then people would be more responsive to me. If only. Pastors assume a lot of if only guilt on themselves, by the way. If only I had prepared my sermons better. If only I'd given it a little more time. If only I was more natural in my presentation. If only I was more passionate in my speaking. If only I'd organized the church better to get more people involved, then they would be more invested and they would listen more. Pastors are terrible in this. We assume a lot more power than we've been given. I'm here to tell you this morning to relax and to quit taking that kind of blame on yourself. This is not about you. This is not about me. It's about the Holy Spirit moving and drawing people to Himself, and about those same people being open to that movement. If you go back through the book of Acts, Luke says that thousands of people were converted. In various segments in there, he says, and 10,000, 3,000, 2,000 responded, were baptized. He keeps giving these little reports. Many, after hearing an untrained Jewish fisherman in Acts 2, a guy named Peter, who called out the people to repent and to follow Jesus, many turned to follow, thousands. But here you have one of the best constructed speeches and one of the best speakers, and yet no one is converted. They're just riled up. You see, God always gives people the freedom to be open or closed to His message. And frankly, it's actually a whole lot harder to be closed than it is to be open. When Paul describes his own conversion in verse 14, Jesus asks him, he says, "Saul, Saul, why are you harassing me? It's hard for you to kick against the spirit." Or more literally, it's hard for you to kick against the goad. The reference is to the stick that ox herders used to drive their oxen. And they would take the stick and they would put a little goad or thorn on the end, which was used to prick the animal when it was veering in the wrong direction. Why do you subject yourself to such pain to do your own thing? It's not that God is poking us or paining us, but it's really the path of least resistance to go with God's flow. Yet God does not make us do so. God never makes us do that. He's given people the choice. And no matter how many times you pray for a person, no matter how hard you pray for a person, or how clearly you explain the message to them, God never takes the choice from them. And because people are people with their own agendas and their own prejudices and their own sins, even the best sermons are slept through or sneered at. So don't take it personally. I don't think Paul did. I love his earthy response here in verse 29 to King Agrippa. He says, whether it is a short or a long time, I pray to God that not only you, but also to all who are listening to me today will become like me, except for these chains. Paul was unfazed by their unresponsiveness and unwavering in his message. Indeed, this is an indicator of spiritual health. Healthy Christians are unfazed by unresponsiveness and are unwavering optimists in sharing the message of Jesus. And that is the key point this morning. I'd rather have this than Madalyn. Healthy Christians are unfazed by unresponsiveness and are unwavering optimists in sharing the message of Jesus. And that is a mouthful, especially for anyone that is working on learning English, of which we have a few. And so I've chosen actually 4 power words for today. 4 words that would be good to add to your vocabulary. Unfazed means not confused. It means you're not worried. It doesn't rattle your cage. Unresponsiveness means not responsive, that people are not paying attention to you or believing you or acting in the way that you are trying to get them to act. They aren't responding in the way you want them to respond. Unwavering means that you don't give up. You keep going. You don't change. You just keep going at it. An optimist is someone who continues to think that the best outcome could still happen. The best outcome could still happen. Healthy Christians are unfazed by unresponsiveness and are unwavering optimists in sharing the message of Jesus. You may not care what I have to say, but I'm going to keep you on my 2015 light list. That is the prayer list that we're keeping in of people that we're praying for every week. And perhaps sooner or later you'll become a believer too. There are 2 practical ideas that I want you to grab onto here this morning, and I've said them already, but in a slightly different way. So let me restate them. And the first one is this: we aren't defended by rejection because ultimately we can only be responsible for our own decisions. We aren't defended by rejection because ultimately we can only be responsible for our own decisions. Paul made a decision to follow Jesus for himself. He did so on the Damascus Road, but no matter how well he communicated, he could not make that decision for anyone else. Secondly, we need to leave the door open for resistant people. We need to leave the door open for resistant people. For the late arrivals, we want to leave the door unlocked. We want to leave it jarred open. Now, from what we know about Agrippa, his sister, wife Bernice, or Festus, none of them ever became believers. Yet I love Paul's warm spirit here. Whether it is a short or a long time, I pray to God that not only you, but also all who are listening to me today will become like me. Whether it is a short or a long time. That's how I've come to look at every conversation, every interaction, every sermon, every class, whether it is a short or a long time. Hey, if they don't quite get it this time, perhaps next time through, the light bulb will click on and something will happen. I'm willing to take a long-term approach. On one of my Guam trips, I had one of my former students approach me because he wanted to talk about something that I had said to him in the spiritual formation class that we had, that he was in, my spiritual formation class. And the thing is, it was 5 years earlier. I mean, this is 5 years ago. There was a gap of 5 years between the time that I had him in my class and the time that he approached me. And it's dumbfounding when someone quotes something I said years ago, and I barely remember saying it, but it sounded like me. But he remembered it word for word, which is scary. He had been stewing on it for a while, 5 years. And he wished that he had taken it to heart earlier. He said that it would have spared him a lot of pain. And he is trying to figure out how to get back on track, how to start living the message. And we've got a great message, regardless of how people respond to it, or how slowly or how quickly they respond to it. Verse 23, this is the New Living Translation here. The Messiah would suffer, this is the message, the Messiah would suffer and be the first to rise from the dead, and in this way announce God's light to Jews and Gentiles alike. Jesus died for all people and rose so that all people might have new lives now and through eternity. And that is the good news, whether it is accepted or not. So, would anyone be willing to add a word of testimony or perhaps make a comment or ask a question? Show me you're listening. Let me prime the pump a little bit. In verse 24, Festus called Paul crazy. Do you think that he actually believed Paul was crazy, or was he just being dramatic? Or maybe it was a defense mechanism. When people look at you like you're crazy, do they really think that? Or is there something going on inside of them? What do you think? Or what do you do to avoid the appearance of craziness?
Nothing. You know how I feel about being crazy. It's how it is. If we weren't a little bit crazy for God, would it really work?
Say that again. If
we
we
weren't a little bit crazy for God, would it really work?
Would it really work?
Well, you try to share your culture with younger people today and their culture, and they don't think you've got it all together, that something's missing, like between your ears.
Yeah.
Well, it's fun to be one generation behind and then talking to the next generation below, because I can listen to my parents and see my kids and be in between all that and see all the different layers of crazy. How my parents can look at me and I can misunderstand they're crazy, and then look at my kids and misunderstand all the different levels of faith and the interpretations and how it comes across. Somehow God has his own way of working it all out.
Isn't that interesting? It's actually possible for people that are old to communicate with people that are young. Culturally, that doesn't work. But somehow, the Holy Spirit makes it work. Isn't that interesting? How do you respond when your best sermon is rejected by others? What's your reaction to that?
I didn't get that.
How do you respond when your best sermon is rejected by others? Are you offended?
I used to pout.
Do you pout? How should we respond when our best sermon is rejected by others? What's that?
With optimism.
With optimism. Somebody was listening.